No, yeah. That's right, you're a
Now
with her. Oh my God, why am I thinking that? It used to be. For some reason, I thought I read something like that. Oh my God. I think that's an avenue.
All right, well, thank you all so much for coming out. This is Thick Books Presents award-winning author, former editorial director of Builder magazine, and founding editor of Residential Architect magazine, Boyce Thompson. Tonight we will discuss, as you can see, the forever home, designing our houses to last a lifetime. I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It is really with your support that we are able to do such incredible events. We produce close to 200 author events per year. So no matter what your interest is, whether it just be strictly architecture and homes, might not be doing a ton of those events, but we do a lot of events for readers of all ages, readers of all interests. So be sure to check out our event calendar on our website, left-bank.com, for information about all of our upcoming events. We are producing in-person events as well as virtual. We have people joining us virtually, I'm certain. So if you are ever like, I would really like to make that event, but I can't do it tonight, you can either watch from home or you can watch at a later point in time. All of our events like this one are saved on our YouTube. So you can watch and find all sorts of incredible books. One event that I will tell you about, coming right up next Thursday, is an event with one of my favorite authors, Patrick Radden-Keefe, who is the author of Say Nothing and Empire of Pain, which is back in the news with the Sackler family. He has this new book called Rogues, which is a true crime series of essays. It's really incredible. That event is going to be next Thursday. Patrick Radden-Keefe has won 8,000 awards and is a really incredible journalist. So if you are interested in that event, tickets are on sale now on our website, left-bank.com. About tonight's book. Most people live in homes that become dysfunctional when their family circumstances change, whether it is suddenly having to work from home, new mobility changes, or an unexpected in-law arriving on the scene. Oof, I hope that doesn't It doesn't have to be that way. Houses can be designed to accommodate family needs now and in the future. Interviews with 20 homeowners and their designers illustrate flexible solutions to a variety of living arrangements. Combined with photographs and floor plans, the case studies represent different perspectives from young families to divorcees, single-parent households, and retirees. Tips at the end of each chapter address issues such as key lifestyle questions to ask before designing a forever home, where not to skimp, and how to plan spaces for double and triple duty. Designing an adaptable home has economic, environmental, and emotional rewards. With smart planning, it's possible to build a beloved house that can be passed through the generations. We do have copies of the book available for sale at the desk that you can purchase afterwards. And I will say it is with your purchase of a book that we're able to do such incredible events. And not only is it helping out Left Bank Books, it is helping the local economy by keeping the streets paved, the libraries funded, parks free, all sorts of things. So thank you for buying the book tonight. Boyce Thompson is the author of Anatomy of a Great Home and the New Home. The former editor of Builder magazine and founding editor of Residential Architect magazine, Thompson has spent more than 30 years writing about home design and construction and jurying design competitions. He lives in Bethesda, Maryland, and is joining us tonight. Would you please help me in welcoming the incredible
All right, I really appreciate everybody coming out. There he is, Mr. Jerry Teal. So this is a big sacrifice on your behalf. I really appreciate it. I thought this would be fun, and then for a while there, I was thinking I probably shouldn't have done it. Then my wife said, "No, you got to do this. Like, how many people know somebody who's written 6 books?" Right. So maybe you all know somebody else who's written 6 books. I feel like I'm back, back to the future, like in high school, looking out in the classroom of my own colleagues. But I was thinking about high school. I can't remember anything from high school except running laps around a track. And that's like basically all I can remember. And I don't think that I used any of the knowledge I gained in high school to write any of the books that I've written. It's kind of bizarre. But so what have I been doing for the last decade? I have 4 published books, like a quartet of books about residential architecture. You know, they're each different. Anatomy of a Great Home is maybe my best work. And then I wrote a book about resilient design, designing for disaster. And the whole idea is that global warming is getting worse. You're seeing more wildfires, more flooding, you know, tornadoes, hurricanes, they're all linked. It's getting worse, and building codes don't really address any of this. So if you were building or remodeling a home, what do you do? And that book won an award. It didn't sell a lot. It's a pretty negative thing, but whatever, I wrote it. According to my wife, it's the only book I wrote that really matters. So I got 2 more on the way. This is kind of what I did during the pandemic. This is my pride and joy here. It's a 500-page history book that was academically reviewed. There's 600 citations in it. It took me 10 years to write. So I wrote it all the time. I'm thinking of critics and friends, guys I play softball with, and said, "Oh, you're writing picture books. That's not that hard." Well, okay, it is. But anyway, so this is a narrative, a long narrative. And then I wrote a book about something, a fascinating topic, mass timber construction. So they're like these signature projects in cities all over the country. We have one architect here, Tim Bussey from Newtown, St. Charles. So I have to write or talk to him too, okay? Because I want to impress him. But then I got all these world famous architects in this book. And the whole idea is you can build now with these big pieces of mass timber, glue lam beams and laminated veneer lumber. In Milwaukee, hell, they've got a project, an apartment building that's 26 stories tall and it's built with wood. Wow. So you think about it, the first question people say is, well, is it going to burn? Well, if you ever, imagine you're sitting around a campfire and somebody throws a telephone book into the fire. And how long is it going to take that telephone book to burn? Forever. So in a way, it's actually more fire resistant than steel. It's catching up. The real reason you do it is you sequester carbon. You know, instead of the carbon intensive concrete and steel, you're using wood, which actually takes the carbon out of the atmosphere and stores it in the building for as long as the building stands. So it's a really neat environmental play. So I was thinking, the topic of my book, The Forever Home, about all the things we can no longer do in St. Louis. Here's Joey, my sister-in-law.
Sorry we're late.
The whole story plan, big room, and Ed Einstein. Nice to see you.
Hi. Making a quiet entrance.
As usual.
So we can't go on the Admiral anymore. They tore down the Century building, which was a classic. The DeVille Hotel, postmodern mid-century architecture, gone. And of course, my favorite Pope's Cafeteria. You remember going there? I could have done 10 slides of this, right? Yeah. So what's the moral of that story? The whole idea is that the stuff just goes away, and that's not particularly good for the planet, right? Because anytime you have to start over, you're consuming all sorts of more resources. So all my books have this kind of left-wing angle to them. I'll admit to you all, since probably share a lot of the same perspective, but that's kind of what motivated the book, The Forever Home. Also, okay, so people were staying in their homes much longer. It used to be like we were all passing through, right? We get a better job, we move to a bigger house, we get transferred, we buy another house, and now we're living on average 13 years in a house. It's probably longer than that now. And then we were all trapped in the house during the pandemic. So that'd be my first audience participation question. Thinking back on that experience, was it good or bad? Now thinking of the way you related to your house, how many people would say that was satisfying, it was a good experience? Most people. And then how many would say it wasn't a very good experience, the house was lacking? No, but only, my son Ethan admitted to that. And of course, the third category is how many of you don't give a damn? But it was kind of interesting to interview people during that time and find out what was working for them, what wasn't. And first I did this like theoretical exercise. What constitutes a forever home? So I developed criteria, and then I went out and I tried to find projects. The whole book took me 3 years to do, right? Because it was real difficult to find projects I could write about that met the criteria, and then projects where the homeowner would submit to an interview, because I wanted to do that. I wanted to make it different. And I thought I found one perfect project. I contacted the architect, said, well, I don't know, the homeowner's reticent, publicity shy. I'll contact her and see what she says. And he called me back a couple days later and she said, no, she doesn't want to be in the book, but she said, thank you, she's read all of your other books and took all your advice. So it would have been the perfect project, right? But anyway, some of these things are difficult. Like it's built with durable materials. Like a forever home would probably be built with what, stone and slate, brick. And a lot of this stuff is beyond the means of people today, right? So a lot of these houses, you'll see they've got fiber cement siding, which is, that stuff's go-to. People like it a lot. And then maybe there's some cedar on it just because they love the look. And I'm missing some other things. But, there's substitutes out there that are equally as long-lasting that don't cost as much. So, part of my motivation was devilish. Because like you look around and you see all these houses and builders are built for a starter market or for a move-up market. And then what happens is once your lifestyle changes, once you have a kid, once your kids leave, once your in-laws come to live with you, the house doesn't function anymore. Or the worst is, of course, once you start having any kind of mobility issue or visual impairments, things like that. And the house is absolutely not appropriate for you. So my wife went through that, spent 20 grand on a new bathroom for her daughter who's confined to not a daughter, but her sister is confined to a wheelchair. I see houses all over Bethesda, Maryland, where I live. Bethesda's a lot like Clayton. These beautiful homes, and there'll be wheelchair ramps to the front door because they didn't do the one thing that makes sense to do. There they are, the Sabbaths.
I'm not a Sabbath.
I think I'm really grateful. Everybody said they showed up or showed up. So, and I know that this isn't everybody's cup of tea, but still, thank you very much for coming. So, anyway, during the pandemic, things had surfaced. Kind of interesting. And I went back to the architects who designed the houses in the book and asked them whether people are still asking for these things. And they said, by and large, they are. Maybe the one thing, there isn't as much desire for like germ-resistant surfaces as there was during the pandemic. And maybe because interest rates are a little higher, people aren't doing, beautifully architecturally designed outdoor spaces because that's something that might fall off the budget. But the desire for like a home office, it's like the Zoom office, that's like here to stay. It's crazy. Maybe the orientation of the office is different now. Tim, you probably face this where you need to show those books behind you, all those great books that you've read. Right? Instead of having a corridor of an office, you need it to be like the other way. Yeah. So that's kind of neat. School workspaces. I gathered all these incredible stories of people who had to like find space in their house for kids to go to school. And some kids, I'll tell you some of them as we go along. Home offices, though, was a big one because before the pandemic, I would tell people, geez, do you really need a dedicated home office? Your Wi-Fi system in your house is so good, you can work anywhere, right? You can work on the back porch, you can work on the sofa, so that's great. But then during the pandemic, with everybody at home, kids at home, then you really needed refuge someplace. So we even saw some backlash over open floor plans. Because that's the rage. If you build a new home these days, you see these, like Mary's house, you've got this wide open floor plan, and noise transfer. If everybody's home all the time, it can get pretty busy, and you need a place to escape. Because a lot of people use the pandemic to engage in like individual pursuits, like practicing music or stargazing, stuff like that. So anyway, you need that space, the away room. And okay, so I'm gonna take you through just some of these projects if this will work for me. It's not going to work. All right, Tim, can you push me up the slide? Pay you afterwards. Here's my help. Oh. All right, so there's something called a livability standard. Okay, now I know that most of you are not going to go out and build a new home today. Gabe, thanks for showing up, appreciate it. You know, I know you're not gonna go out, maybe Tom, you're gonna build a new house, you come back to St. Louis. Some things to think about, okay, so one is like have at least one no threshold entry. So that if somebody was in a wheelchair or a walker, or even if you hurt your leg playing sports or whatever, it's easy to get in the house. So a bunch of the houses, almost all the houses in the book have that. There's something called a livability standard.
Now it's working.
Yeah, so the other things in the livability standard is it's nice to have a first floor bedroom, place where you could maybe have guests initially, but you could move down to. And then also a bathroom that could be a powder, but maybe it's expandable, so it become a full-scale bathroom down the pipe. That's what the livability standard is. I've got a bunch of houses in the book where the homeowners were really smart and they had a growth strategy. So they built smaller homes at the start, maybe rented spaces, saved their money, and then they built, an accessory dwelling unit. So these, you know, I don't know, have you ever read about these accessory? Wow. Wow, there was a proposal in Bethesda, Maryland, where I live, to allow these, and there was unbelievable blowback from entrenched homeowners trying to prevent it, you know, saying that it was going to lead to the degradation of the neighborhood. Then they put all these setback requirements in it. Then they called for like more parking spaces if you were going to do these. Like, they effectively killed it.
Big fight in Boulder.
Big fight, yeah. So, but it's a good thing. I mean, I think about when I was working full time, I would do these juries, these design competitions in Woodstock, Vermont. Take my family there. Community's like 200 years old, and you walk down the street, every other house would have something in the backyard, a carriage house, you know, an apartment over the garage. So it happens organically, you know, as people like have the need for the space, but now they're trying to stop it, basically, jurisdictionally. So the whole story here is long and involved. I won't tell it. So it's working. Anyway, this is an architect, his house in Rhode Island, and he did something similar. So smart, designs houses for people, right? So he knew he couldn't have everything he wanted. It was, you know, he's not very wealthy, but he knew there were certain things he should do at the start, and other things that could wait till later. Ingenious. You know, like some of the big builders used to market homes to people in Wisconsin like this. Like Wisconsin buyers are somehow smarter than everyone else in the country, you know. So you get an unfinished basement that you could finish out later, or an attic with ceilings that were tall enough you could put a room up there down the pipe. But anyway, he did a lot of work behind the walls, put in great electrical, HVAC systems, things that you'd want right away to keep utilities low. But then he held back on finished materials. He used IKEA cabinets. You know, they look great, but maybe when he's making a lot more money than he is today, then he can go whole hog on that kitchen, do like the designer kitchen of his dreams. So there are all sorts of neat games that you could play here that make a lot of sense. And he planned for future editions. So I told Tim I was not going to like point to floor plans like this. There's the future outdoor shower. Talk about discretionary item. Huh? Why would you build that now? But then this is inspired. This is the addition. So after he can't stand having the kids so close to the primary bedroom, he moves them over here in the teenage years. And then he creates this nice little, outdoor space, a courtyard area where he can do all sorts of landscaping. It's kind of fun to think about. Think big. So this is what he did now. What can wait till later. Oops. So, it's funny. Back in the 1950s, after the Second World War, there was this huge demand for housing. And this gentleman, this developer named Joseph Eichler, built a lot of great mid-century modern ranch houses. And they were marketed as forever homes. And this guy was like your house.
Willowbrook.
But they were marketed as forever homes. And the reason, I bet your house didn't have this, they were made with steel and concrete and glass. They were like, but anyway, and redwood. So I talked with the architect who does the work. He specializes in remodeling these houses. And I said, well, what'd you find when you opened up the walls? And he said, it was remarkably clean. Basically these huge redwood eaves that protected the house. There was no moisture behind the walls. And this couple just did this outstanding job of returning it to its former glory. And look at that space. It's like all you would ever need, right? Like the way that the indoors goes to the outdoors and the way the connection of the outdoor and the indoor spaces. I mean, the architects were thinking about this way back in the 1950s, you know, and it all got lost as this baby boomers chased nostalgic housing designs in the 70s and 80s. But now it's making a little bit of a comeback. So the other thing that's really cool here is you see that patio door, and use the pointer. That's a keeper of the trend. It folds back. And you get these unbelievable rooms where you don't know if you're inside or outside. You know, it breaks down the boundary between indoors and outdoors. It's something, if you were thinking about building a deck or patio off your living room or whatever, you should definitely look into these slider door systems that used to cost, what, 30 grand, and now you can get them for less than 10. And they're like total game changers. They're to die for, the spaces they create. So, well, I'm pointing in the wrong direction, that would help. Here's an example of a house in Austin, Texas, where, you know, there's this porch that's kind of indoors, but maybe outdoors, and it's where this couple spends all their time. Also, there's been a renaissance in passive solar architecture. I mean, Tim, tell me if I'm wrong, but I mean, a lot of it is motivated by the fact that sunshine is free. You know, and there are all sorts of studies showing that the sun makes you happy. So why not take advantage of it, right? Especially if you can lower your heating bills. So a lot of that is happening, and it's an example of it in back where I live in DC. So this is a house in Australia. I went somewhat international with the book, but a couple had 3 children, all studying from home. You know, can you imagine what that must have been like? And they were working from home too. It's like, I'm so glad that I'd grown out of that, you know. But the kids, of course, all had different study habits. You know, they had a young daughter who needed to be alone, quiet time, had a gregarious son who wanted to sit at the dining room table and kind of work with others while he was doing it. So there was that consideration, and thankfully their house was so flexible and designed they could like meet the needs of all their kids. So I managed to incorporate resilient architecture in the book because when you think about it, you know, a house isn't going to last forever if the next storm is going to come and blow it down. And this is like a great example. I wish I'd had this case study for my previous book, Designing for Disaster, but this couple, 2 architects, Sioux City, Iowa, and they're within 500 feet of the Mississippi River. So after they bought the land, there was a 500-year flood that totally inundated the lot, right? So they're like, okay, what do we do? The building codes were changed to make sure that you built up 100 feet above the floodplain. But you know, the last storm had been 500 feet. Am I getting that right? Yeah. No. What did I say? Anyway, the 500-year storm. So you had to build to the requirements of a 100-year storm in the building code. But the last, you know, flood had been a 500-year storm. So anyway, they had to raise the building pad, and then they did a bunch of other things because they were worried about tornadoes and what do you call it, pelting rain or whatever. Hail. So they've got a hail-proof siding supposedly, and they built a dugout where they can go a couple times a year when actually tornadoes come up through the tornado alley. So one of the findings of my last book, the other thing that they did was they had a classic situation where there was a downstairs guest bedroom, and once their kids started studying in the upstairs family room, which was kind of close to all the other bedrooms, the kids said, you know, why don't you get out of here and move downstairs so we can have more alone time? So they made an early move to their first floor primary bedroom, and it was neat that the house was flexible enough to accommodate that. So the other thing about ADUs is, and this is a project in Seattle, Washington, where the developer always puts ADUs in the houses, and first-time buyers use them to generate income, help them afford a mortgage. So there are a lot of good reasons why you'd want to do this. One couple kind of leased the apartment to visiting artists who were participating in a university down the street. They're all sorts of uses. During the pandemic, one couple turned the ADU into a home office because they had to work from home. And then it became a nursery after she gave birth. So it's amazing the flexibility they give you. Then there's the old-fashioned granny suite. Does anybody know what that is? That's like the apartment over the garage where you used to house Granny. You know, the only problem is that Granny probably has trouble getting up the steps. So like, you needed to leave some kind of elevator core, right, to get her up there, unless you didn't want to see her again. But anyway, so this has got this tremendous, it's a production house in Portland, a tremendous, like there it is, actually there it is, the Granny Suite. And then there's this door right here. So you could effectively close it off and use it as a rental, generate income, or you could open it up and then it's just part of the house. And that's the way it was typically used during the pandemic. One couple, an elderly couple, their grandson couldn't go to school because of like medical problems, and so they took him in, and this was his room, you know, and spent most of his time up there. So it was a really neat thing. Anyway, it's something you can do that doesn't necessarily cost a lot more, but it gives you way more flexibility. So I've got a lot of stuff in the book about how to make small spaces read larger. And some of this is kind of fun because you can use it in any home, you know. But the whole idea is basically to create sight lines to windows. Anytime you see that, you feel, oh, wow, this is an expansive space. And then if you can draw the eye upward as opposed to downward, then people get the impression that it's a bigger space too. So there are all sorts of tricks. They're kind of fun, and the best architects use them liberally. You know, things like creating these built-ins. All you have to do is bump the wall out a little bit. You bump the hallway out 1 foot, you can create built-in bookshelves. Here's another example up on the right. When you walk in the front door, you look through the family room, and it's right out to the landscape part of the house. So it's a really special moment. And another thing that became really important during the pandemic was that people were longing for separation between public and private spaces. You know, and some of this was due to the fact, when you think about it, like, you know, married couple, say you commuted to work and you had alone time, right, in the car, you had alone time at work, and now suddenly you're with your spouse 24/7. And, you know, I probably shouldn't say this with my son around, but, you know, maybe that's not the best thing for me. I need some space to actually write, to think, whatever. So I think it's important to be thinking in terms of like how spaces would be used to create private spaces. So this is a classic example of an office. Like if you were working alone during the day, you could have these doors open and then you could enjoy the views outside, right? But if other people were in the house, you could close it off, and then you'd have privacy. So there are all sorts of cool ways to do this that I address in my book. I'm going to gloss over this. So, you know, I wanted to somehow incorporate production architecture into the book. I always give it a nod somehow. And I don't know, how do you feel about these new farmhouse houses that are being built? Does anybody like them?
Yeah.
I mean, I kind of do. I feel guilty in liking them because it's like they're so anachronistic, but they kind of feel a little bit modern. You know, did you have any St. Charles?
Yeah, it's all over. It's everywhere. The biggest problem is that you take the materials randomly and put them on a traditional suburban house. It isn't a farmhouse form as much as it's just an applicated material. That's what we see here.
Well, this almost looks a little modern, transitional, because you got lots of glass and metal, and then the vertical orientation is pretty cool.
Right.
I think
That's a production house?
Yeah.
Wow.
I am, so kind of.
Beautiful.
Whoops. The other thing I addressed in the book is the whole idea of a retirement house. Because when I started as a cub reporter back in the 80s, I'd go to these communities in Phoenix and Palm Springs, and we'd visit homes designed for empty nesters. And they'd be these big party houses, right, with these ginormous living rooms and big porches and pools. And so there was no attention paid if you weren't having a party to how you would live in the space. Well, that's kind of made a big right turn. And now you see all sorts of functional storage built into these houses. And this is just a great example of it. It's a house in Bend, Oregon, that I like a lot. and it cleans up really nicely. So that's when all the panels are closed, the doors are closed, you get a nice clean surface, but then this opens to show the TV, pardon me, this opens to show bookshelves, this opens to like show the way into the back bedroom area, so it's a really cool design in my mind. And so clean storage spaces. I only got a couple more things I want to leave with you. A lot of my book deals with asking yourself questions, like how you really want to live at home. Most people never ask themselves those questions, but there are a few things that make sense to before you start any kind of project, or even just remodel your home. Like, how do you watch TV? How much time? How do you enjoy spending time together with your spouse or loved one? How do you enjoy spending time apart? How many people can comfortably cook in the kitchen? So that was a huge issue for this family, and the designer actually came and visited them in their old house and then gave them a new design based on how he thought they really wanted to live. So I thought it was really a nice gesture, a great house. And if I could get over real quick. So here are those questions, I'm going to go over them. And a lot of my book also deals with this whole idea of how to age in place. I'm not going to go into that in great detail, but there are all sorts of tricks that if you design a house that way in the beginning or during a remodeling project, it doesn't cost you a lot more. As a matter of fact, it shouldn't cost you any more. But then you can actually live in the house forever. And one of the basic marketing problems is that builders don't want to make you feel like if you bought this house or a certain house that you're old. They don't want to put anything in there that smacks of institutional design, right? But there's certain other things they overlook that every house should include. I'm going to skip that one. Just a little bit about courtyard spaces. I don't know, some people are deck people, some people are patio people. I love patios. I just think, and then the idea of having a courtyard, it kind of merges with my interior space. Whoa, it's just like to die for in my mind. And I've got all sorts of great examples in the book of people who've done these killer courtyards. Okay, you need the right climate, but you know what? They're building these things now in Seattle and Chicago. So it's like taking the country by storm. And it's something to think about if you like. And then this was a house in Rehoboth that was built up to the 100-year floodplain. And the whole idea was they kept existing trees, added vegetation, and the whole thing soaks up water if there happens to be a nor'easter that dumps on the place. So a little bit, my son is an environmental lawyer, so I thought I'd touch a little bit on resiliency. But basically, if you're living someplace where there's a threat of a tornado or hurricane or flooding, I mean, you're without any help, basically. I don't think that building codes, by and large, do not protect you in that situation. So, and the problem is that most people resort to FEMA maps, FEMA flood maps, and those are woefully out of date. And I've got this one piece of data here to show it. Basically, they're missing almost half of the areas that are susceptible to flooding, including a lot here in St. Louis. I know where we've had a couple major floods. And there are things you can do to mitigate a flood. You can raise the house above the floodplain. You can raise all the utilities. If you've got big storms coming in, like this house before was designed to withstand a tsunami. And the whole idea here is the house is passive. If the storm hits, it wipes out these garage doors and just flows up and through. And then everything on that lower level, there's no exposed electrical, no exposed utilities. So anyway, the house just takes the blow and then it remains standing. Also because it's built with steel and it's got piers, driven deep in the ground. But anyway, there's a whole way to do this. It's really not being done. And now that I've bored you to tears, a couple of things. It's kind of, my book Designing for Disaster came out. I got a call from Fortune magazine and the reporters asked me, so is resilient homes the next custom home amenity? And I'm like, is this what rich people are going to ask for now and everybody else is SOL? And I'm like, okay, maybe. But that wasn't what I set out to prove. I mean, you just have to do the research and figure out whether the house would be vulnerable. But yeah, it's like if you do have a lot of money, you can insist on it and get it done. So protection from rising waters. I'll spare you that. Then, one thing, active solar, you probably read this, but the cost of an active solar system, and I don't have my notes, unfortunately. Can't remember what the average cost of a project is, but it's half the price of what it was 5 years ago. So like every house in the book either has these photovoltaic panels on the roof or else it's pre-wired for them. It's like a no-brainer. You just have to have the right, a roof facing in the right direction. It doesn't have to be the main house either. It could be garage or some other parts building on the parcel. So it's really something to look at. And then the whole idea of taking advantage of solar to heat your house. So I told Peggy I would include this just because it's engineering and I want her to think that I really know engineering. But the problem with building codes is that they're designed for wind and water that hits from the top, right? But during these big storms, it hits from the side. So what happens, the houses sway and then they fall apart. So you see these pictures on CNN after these, big natural disasters, whoa, look at that damage. Well, some of it could have been prevented had they tied together the roof and the floor and, put fasteners that hold the walls to the foundation. There's a whole science to it. It's in the model building codes, but the local jurisdictions don't adopt it. And they don't adopt it because the home builders object to it. And here I am on national TV saying this. But it's an absolute travesty because it would maybe cost $3,000 to put these connectors everywhere so the house would be safe. And you could spend that much on a granite countertop, right? So you forego something and you spend it to create a house that's safe and will last for generations. It makes sense, a lot of sense to me, but you got to do the research to figure out, what to do. So, and then finally, the whole idea here is this is a couple that bought a house near the lake in Chicago. The house was going to be torn down, and they saw that it had promise. They hired an architect, reasonably priced architect, and he gave them this killer house with an updated floor plan. They kept a lot of the original materials, and they feel really good about what they've done, and they plan to live in their house forever. So, anyway, that's what I've been up to. I hope I told you something you didn't know, maybe inspired you a little bit. And play soft, and thank you. Stop right there. I think I went over a bit. I apologize for that. Well, not too much, but anyway, thanks so much for coming. And it's really meant a lot to me, and I'll never forget it. But, anyway, thanks a lot. It'd be great if you bought my book, and I'd be happy to sign it. Also, I'll give you. My wife was asking me, what are we going to do with all these new home books? Well, this was my first book. In my mind, it was my best. I'll give you a free copy of the new home if you want to buy one. And they also, the bookstore went ahead and bought some of my other ones too, so I appreciate that. And whatever you decide is great. Anyway, thanks for coming.
Do you want to take some audience questions?
Oh, yeah. Right. Does anybody have questions? I mean, you don't have to. I'm going to keep it here a long time. Tom does. Oh.
St. Louis, you didn't mention earthquake in there anywhere. I didn't hear earthquake. Is that something? Obviously, that's something.
Yeah, I mean, earthquakes happen far more frequently in far more places than people realize.
Right.
It's something to look at the maps.
New Hampshire cold.
Yeah.
What kind of house do you live in, Boyce?
Maybe Ethan can describe it. I don't have a passion for housing. I have a great back room, an office with beautiful windows looking out on the backyard. And I'm
Which direction?
Very south. So it's so
Design
bad.
your house?
No.
Okay.
We lived in People's Republic at Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C. for a long time. We had a communist for a mayor. And then we had everybody wore Birkenstocks. It was required footwear. And then we moved to Bethesda, which is like Clayton, once our kids got to school age, because they were getting in fights and stuff. So anyway, we just bought a house, the house that we could. And at one point there, I could have, designed something. I had a little bit of a hankering, but now, it's and all my books address this. I mean, you can get satisfaction from most any space if you kind of know what you're doing, there's probably, you think about when you're happiest in your house and then look around, like, that probably tells you something about, what you want more of and what you can use less of. So I don't really care how my house appears to the street. I have a split level. It's brick, it's nice, it's sturdy, it was built in the 1950s, but, yeah, Holly.
Yeah, so Boyce, you mentioned something about, this direction of building homes or buildings with wood, like that's supposed to be the new way to go and
Yeah.
actually better during fire, but, I've got this concern about forests being totally, decimated, and so I don't understand how that's,
Well, the good thing
a
about
good
mass
thing.
timber, it's done from like, a bad wood that would be thrown away.
Renewable, it's a renewable resource,
Yeah, it's
actually.
farmed.
How's that? How's it renewable?
They plant trees.
Yeah, well, you have to make sure, if you're gonna do this, that you're buying, forest certified renewable trees. You have to make sure that the company selling the trees is planting a tree for every tree it cuts down. That's part of the equation if it's gonna be, carbon
They're
neutral.
not shipped from too far afield.
Yep, it's gotta be close by. I'm sure you should be giving this presentation. And then the big thing is the type of wood. They're not using Doug fir. They're not using old growth pine. They're using hemlock. And woods that might get thrown away. But what happens is it's engineered wood. So it's thrown in this melting pot with glues
Gotcha.
and pressed together. And then the beauty of it is it can be milled and cut to like these phenomenal shapes. So the architects, it's like some of the best in the world, are going nuts designing these killer spaces. It's mostly in commercial.
Okay.
That's, there's some of it's being done in new houses. But,
Well, clearly I didn't
Yes.
understand that concept of
Yeah.
engineered wood.
yeah, it's engineered wood.
Farmed and engineered.
Kathy, what do you got?
I'm curious if you're seeing a trend, or if other people are across the country, of building smaller, smarter homes. We are not seeing that in our community, and we live outside of Salt Lake.
Yeah.
And we are in a small city. I mean, and the homes are gargantuan.
It's crazy, isn't it?
It's absolutely.
I know all these
But you
people in
also,
Western.
you fight it, because when we were building a home, I mean, the builder, the architect are like, it's so much more expensive to build a smaller home. And
Well,
people don't
per
want
s-
smaller
Per
homes.
square
And we were
foot
saying,
it is.
yeah, no, and
Yeah.
that's what it is. And it's like, we fought it.
Yeah.
But I don't know.
Did you
Do
notice this?
see
Like
that
we had,
trend?
after our kids got out of college, we had people in the neighborhood, same demographic, and they built bigger houses.
Right.
It's like, what's going on here? Well, they had the free income, right? Because they're not spending, an extra $50,000 a year to support college tuition. So they went ahead and built the home of their dreams. And then some of them turn around 10 years later and they ask, what the hell's going on? In DC, we have a lot of people moving downtown, or we did before the pandemic. And they would find that when they went downtown to price like a smaller condo or whatever, God, it was like they weren't saving any money. The price on it, like an 1,800 square feet condo was what, the same price as their 3,200 square foot house in the suburbs. So that dynamic is definitely in play, but still a good thing because you don't need the space anymore. So you're heating and cooling, less space, and maybe your lifestyle's a little bit more comfortable when you're not having to climb stairs or go all around. But it's like, the other thing is, like a lot of people tell me, Boyce, I'd really like to find like a 2-bedroom house in our neighborhood that's sized just right for me and my wife and the occasional visitor, but I can't find one. And the reason there is when the house gets torn down, they put up this gargantuan mansion. It's like every single time. So to find a house that's small, you have to move to an existing house maybe 20 miles away, and they want to live close there.
They're scraping all those in our neighborhood.
Yeah. So this is probably more than you thought about housing in a long time. Yeah, what do you got, Ed?
Do you have much hope that the pandemic-induced reduction in the value of commercial real estate can somehow be converted into residential real estate?
Well, I don't know. Even where it's downtown, I'm told like half the buildings downtown are empty, half the space. This is, I don't know what you do. There are a lot of condo projects down there, but I think they're having trouble too. I don't know that it's I don't know that there is a solution. Isn't that bizarre? It's like most people would prefer to work from home, especially if they have a nice office space. You know, it's like the companies are fighting to get them back in, and then the idea of spending money on top. I don't know, what's your experience, Gabe? You working?
Go with that.
Yeah.
I don't think it's as easy as people think to convert office into apartments. That is really expensive.
Yeah, the services are all wrong. They have to, it's a total gut.
And then you've got to convince people to come back to the office.
Not gonna happen.
Well, so, you know, one thing that's interesting is like Microsoft, Amazon, they're all doing these mass timber buildings. So the beauty of those buildings is the timber is exposed inside. And they're hoping that this brings people back. We'll see. Yeah, all the major corporations in America are doing mass timber offices. Crazy. Anybody else? Are you all are really good sports? I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun. I hope you had some fun too.
All right, so we're going to do the signing up here at the front. Bree and Taylor at the desk, ready to sign a copy of the book.
You guys like it? Yeah. It's so nice. I know our son's.
Which this is at? Oh. I'd like to bring you back to St. Louis.
Are you gonna go down the street?
Oh, they are serious.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, you don't need to call.
I didn't think we would need that.
There you go. That's my CD.
Good, how are you? Yeah, I can go sit there Okay, yeah, so the kids have